National University and Operativna Sociologia in Dnipro. I recommend you to visit our homepage. We also have a Facebook group. In the homepage, you can also register to get our newsletter, which will be published about 4 times per year in the next 3 years at least. We hope, of course, to continue also after the project has ended. So that's all about UKRAINETT for now. Now we will go to today's program. And it's a great pleasure for me to invite the first speaker. This is Volodymyr Solovian, who is head of the Hybrid Warfare Analytical Group at the Ukraine Crisis Media Center in Kiev. And Volodymyr is a specialist in information security, Russian disinformation, and Ukrainian defense policy. We will take a Q&A session at the very end, but feel free to already ask questions in the chat. But we will have a possibility to ask questions live after both Volodymyr and the second speaker, whom I will introduce later, will have had their presentations. So now I would like to ask you, Volodymyr, to take over, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thanks so much for having me and the invitation and this great opportunity to give my perspective and the vision of the team of Ukraine Crisis Media Center on the scale and the frame of victory vision from Ukrainian perspective. So now I'd like not to waste much time and to start sharing my screen and the presentation. So to start with, I'd like to bring to your attention the short and brief retrospect of the victory vision by Ukrainian society. These notes are posted on our coverage of Ukrainian media and social pools as well, and statements by politicians. So that is just a brief, complex picture of how Ukrainian society perceived the main goal and what was the vision of the Ukrainian initial goals and the victory vision by Ukrainian society. But it changed dramatically in some way during the different stages of the war. So at the beginning of the war, at the initial phase, from February to early April of 2022, their main goal was to perceive the statehood and perceive the chains of control by different governmental bodies and armored and military units. So that was the main goal, just to keep our statehood and the main narrative that Ukrainian authorities broadcasted towards Ukrainian society was that this war will not last for long, and we will go to negotiations with Russia and reach a deal under which Ukraine will regain control of the territories that were lost since 2022. So that means that the first perception of war was that that will not last for long, because Ukraine cannot sustain on a long protracted war with Russia, and obviously nobody at that time expected that this war will last for years. Then after Russians retrained from Kiev Oblast and Chernihiv Oblast, the remains of Bucha massacre and all other atrocities that Russian occupiers maintained in capital area, they became public, and after that the perception of the goal changed, and also we received some promises from the Western politicians that the West will support Ukraine with weaponry, and that created the the vision, the picture that Ukraine may receive the victory in a military way. So the crucial change of the perception of the war maintained during April and until the June of 2022, because at that time we were expecting large scale of Western shipments of munition, weaponry, etc. That will create the possibilities for Ukrainian armed forces to push out Russians. But at that time, we also understand that Russia will try to regain Donbas region, and the main battlefield occurred at the Donbas. But then the initial occupational bodies of Russian army were exhausted, and that created for Ukraine a possibility to provide successful military operations, and also HIMARS became some kind of game changer at that time. So that created the perception in Ukrainian society, the peak of expectations that Ukraine will succeed and will receive the borders of 1991. And at that time, there was a high expectations from Ukrainians that we will defeat Russia in a military way. But in November and July, there was formed a vision mainly by Western politicians, and given the tendencies of how the West did support Ukraine, and that we didn't receive enough armored vehicles, enough tanks, and even just now we didn't receive any jets of Western type. So that created the understanding that the main idea of the Ukrainian victory is to organize successful operation at south and put the Crimea under suppression, under threat of missile attacks, and that will create beneficial positions for Ukrainian side in another stage of negotiations with Russia. So the main purpose at that time was not to regain all the territories, not to push out Russians from Donbas, but to achieve successful operations at south, and that will bring, from that point of view, that should bring Russia to the understanding that there is no other way than to negotiate with Ukraine on a more sufficient terms of the peace, and give out from regions that were occupied since 2022. But then that came a disappointment after the results of the Ukrainian offensive did not achieve much result. From military point of view, that was quite obvious that without any supplies of Western jets, Ukraine cannot overcome Russian defensive lines, and much time was wasted with no suppression on Russians' preparations to dig trenches, to mine a large scale of territories, and even the direction of the main Ukrainian offensive attempts were quite predictable for Russians. So then in August and October, there came a disappointment in the results of Ukrainian offensive, and that made a shift in terms of perception of the victory by Ukrainian society. And since then, there became I may say, the main transformation of the picture of Ukrainian victory. And under this framework, the main goal is to keep and to sustain Ukraine as a statehood, and to make Russia to pay such a price for their territorial Janins that will exhaust Russia to an extent when Kremlin will go to a for beneficial negotiations for Ukraine and change its demands. So now the territory is not the main goal. I mean, regaining of territories is not the goal for Ukraine in a military dimension of this war. The main goal is to exhaust Russians and to bring the Kremlin to the understanding that they pay too much high price for their offensive operations. And let me bring some forecast for the upcoming half a year for autumn and winter of 2024. From my perspective, Ukraine will not provide any large-scale offensive operations as it was a year before during the summer of 2023. But on a tactical level, there may occur some operations that will disrupt Russians, as Russians are doing now at the north of Kharkiv region. But anyway, there is two ways of developing a situation. From one perspective, Ukraine should not pose itself in just defensive positions, because it may create a political pressure on Western elites that supply Ukraine with weaponry, and that may pose an issue whether Ukraine may achieve any military success at all. So somehow Ukrainian armed forces will try to maintain some offensive operations on a tactical level, and later I will show my vision where these operations may occur. But on a large scale dimension, Ukraine will keep its strategy of exhausting Russia, and I think that that will be the way of how Ukraine will keep itself in this war during the next year. So maybe the preparations of large-scale operations, offensive operations by Ukraine will last until 2025, because until this time, Ukraine should obtain Western jets and to create possibilities to keep airspace under not just control, but just to wipe out Russian aviation from several dimensions where Ukrainian armed forces and armored units may create a suppression on Russian defensive lines. The next slide is about the trends of the second half of the 2024, and it's like a kind of a forecast. So the greatest vulnerability of armed forces of Ukraine in terms of ammunition will be based in July, August of this year. So just in several months, we will receive enough ammunition from United States, from European initiative, which is led by the Czech Republic. But anyway, Russia will keep its superiority in ammunition, in terms of ammunition, and especially given the latest negotiations with North Korea, we may come to the conclusion that during all periods and all the future developments of the war, Russia will keep its superiority in terms of ammunition power. But anyway, another point is that the effect of mobilization, which is holding in Ukraine since the April, will come. These conscripts and these mobilized people will have enough training during the upcoming months, and in the autumn they will come into the units that are deployed in the front line. So in terms of lack of manpower, the situation will become much more better for Ukraine, and that will create opportunities for Ukraine to maintain Russian pressure and to stop their offensive attempts and capabilities. Then the main tendency of the upcoming war is that it will become much more on a distance level, and it will shift towards the targeting of crucial infrastructure in Russia and in Ukraine as well. So the one of the main points for Ukraine is to overcome and to keep resilience of society given the shortages of electricity, and the winter will be a crucial moment of for resilience of Ukrainian society and capabilities of Ukrainian rear to provide enough weaponry that is produced in Ukraine, and especially drones to the front line, given that Ukraine will be under the missile attacks by Russia during the winter, and that will pose a real threat to Ukrainian economy if we will not receive enough until that moment enough systems of air defense systems that may target ballistic targets. And then we come to the moment when Russian forces are exhausted because they conduct non-stop offensive operation since the October of 2023. And we may forecast that in upcoming months they will come to the dilemma that the Russian command should abandon their purposes for strategic operation, or otherwise they should provide the second wave of large-scale mobilization and pick up several hundred thousand new conscripts. But anyway, that is a great issue whether they are capable to provide these new units with enough tanks and armored vehicles. But given the support from North Korea, they may receive several hundreds of old type tanks, for example, the T-54, T-55 or T-62 types, and also a large amount of artillery systems from North Korea, and that may give Russians an opportunity to establish new units and to provide mobilization in much more larger scale. About the battlefield trends for the second half of 2023, I'd like to predict that the biggest issue is whether Ukraine will really obtain the first F-16s, and whether Ukraine will be capable to launch missiles on the Russian territories where Russia deploy the new units and train the new conscripts that will reimburse their losses at the Donbas front line. Then it is a crucial moment for drone industry, and just half a year ago we were on a plateau because in terms of production, Ukraine and Russia keep on the comparable scales. But now we are following that Russians are saying in their Telegram channels, and maybe somehow it may be a way of disinformation, but what we are really witnessing on Ocintars and other sources that Ukraine received a superiority in terms of drones production, and now it is comparable how to Russian superiority in munition terms. So it is 1 to up to 5 in terms of ammunition towards Russia, and from the same point, Ukraine it tries to reimburse this deficit in munition with drones, and especially FPV drones. And during this gap of Western aid, when United States did not ship Ukraine with any ammunition at all, the only way how Ukraine did received any successes and was capable to stop Russian offenses or just slow down were FPV drones. And now we received really priority under Russians in terms of conducting FPV drones attacks. But anyway, Russians are also producing very precise type of drones, especially of operational tactical level, and now they saturated close regions on in depth of Ukrainian rear, and if they receive any kind of picture of Ukrainian units, Ukrainian vehicles, it takes them just several minutes to launch Iskander attacks under these targets, and that produces great losses towards Ukraine. And another challenge is Lancet drones that also turn Ukrainian front line up to several dozens of kilometers, and the deepest recordings of Lancet attacks is outskirts of Kharkiv. So these drones reached the depths of 30 kilometers into Ukrainian territory. But anyway, given the tendencies of the last months of the war, Russia will further conduct these large-scale attacks. And we do not think that Russia will obtain opportunity to create a new army of invasion of several thousand, hundreds of conscripts and make any strategical success. So now, just briefly about the most scary dimension of the front line. It is a Pokrovsky direction. Because after a success in Avdiivka, Russians did not stop their offensives, and until now they are just 7 kilometers. This is the length of this black line. So Russians almost reached the tract between Pokrovsk and another important city of Donetsk region, which is still under control of Ukraine, and that was a threat from logistical point of view. But anyway, Russians have to secure their advance and slow down, because from another point of view, they cannot close the northern claw of this offensive, because they had not succeeded much in northern direction in Chasiv Yar. Because as we see from the large scale of the battlefield, Russians are trying to encircle Turetsky district of Ukrainian defense. So they are pushing their offensive forwards from Chasiv Yar and towards Pokrovsk. And that poses a real pressure on Ukrainian general staff. And, that will maintain the main threat for Ukraine and the main challenge to suppress this main offense at the Donbas, and the Russian goal to encircle Turetsky district of defense. From other point of view, Russians are trying at the same time to create another several pockets under which they will encircle Ukrainian troops in Siversky Lich and in Vuhledar. So that is the main threatful zones of combat during second half year or even in 2025. Because the Russians did not change their tactic at all. Russians do not make any frontline assaults. They're trying to encircle. Another important issue is where Ukraine may conduct its tactical level operations, and my prediction is that Ukraine will continue its operations in delta of Dnieper River, and also there is quite an issue whether Ukraine may also try to cross the main line of Russian defense in Vasilievka and Kamenka region, because during several weeks ago, Ukraine maintained pressure with artillery means at these settlements, and that may also create for Ukraine, if we will succeed in making enough pressure on Russian defensive lines, that may create for Russia an issues whether they will redeploy their reserves. So coming to the conclusions, I'd like to maintain that the main factors that determine the success of Ukraine in 2025 is preparation for the winter in conditions of electricity shortages, because it is mainly about the capacity of Ukrainian area to withhold this war. And also the big issue is how authorities will deal with mobilization and communicate with Ukrainian society on that matter, because misjudgments of the mobilization systems create for Russia many opportunities to intervene into informational space and to create the fake news and to disrupt and to create this gap between Ukrainian society and authorities. Then it is a very important issue is optimization of the command structure and command chains. That is very important to optimize this lane of command to withhold Russians. And we're witnessing that Ukraine made successes at the Kharkiv near Vovchansk in the northern parts of Kharkiv region, but at the same time, Ukraine still cannot freeze the front line after loss of Avdiivka, and that was Russia to Pokrovsk. Then, obviously, the main issue is that the Western aid and whether it will come in time. Then I would like to point to the replenishment of old combat brigades instead of creating new ones, and that is discussed issue in Ukrainian society as well, and in the military sphere. And also Ukraine should keep a high rate of drone production and even implement artificial intelligence technologies into this drone production.
Excuse me, do you think that you can show this Western aid later, because we are running out of time really? We would like to have Tor's presentation as well.
Yeah,
is that sure. Okay? Yes?
Yeah.
So I would like to thank you very much for very thorough and deep analysis of both the different stages of the war and the current situation and even forecasts. Many of you will probably have questions, but we will proceed with our next speaker. This is you can remember your questions, and there will be opportunities to ask Volodymyr in the Q&A session afterwards. So now it is Tor Bukkvoll, who probably doesn't need a lot of introduction, but for people in participants from Ukraine, we could say that he's a well-known specialist in Russian and Ukrainian security and defense policies, and frequent commentator on Ukraine and the war in Ukraine in Norwegian media. The title of Tor's presentation is "Grinding Progress and Huge Losses. Is time on the side of Russia in the war against Ukraine?" And of course, Tor is a senior research fellow at the Norwegian Defense Research Establishment. So please, Tor, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'll try to share my presentation as soon as possible.
Yeah, the screen is yours.
Yeah. Do you all see the presentation in the mood it should be in?
Yes.
Can you confirm, Aadne, that
yes,
is all?
Yes.
We'll okay, thank you. Thank you. So thank you for inviting me to speak. And listening to Volodymyr, I think that although we didn't coordinate our presentations in advance, they will actually fit each other quite well. So I'll start by giving my answer to the question asked on the first slide there: is time on the side of Russia in the war against Ukraine? And my answer would be that as long as Western aid, financially and military, continues at a sufficient level, the answer is no. Time is not on the side of Russia in the war against Ukraine. However, there are a couple of caveats. The first one, Volodymyr already alluded to. Ukraine needs to successfully conduct its mobilization. That is, Ukraine needs to get enough new troops trained and onto the front. We don't really have, or I haven't seen very much evidence on how this is going yet. It's ongoing as we're speaking, but that is a necessary condition in addition, obviously, to the Western military assistance. And then the second caveat is that things would change very much, I think, if Russia suddenly changed its strategy and instead of trying to take new territories to steal more of Ukrainian land, if Russia instead decided that what we have for now is enough and that it stopped going on the offensive and basically dug down where it is and tried to maintain that. That would change the situation very much. So, but this is problematic for Putin, probably for a couple of reasons. First is that with the territories that Russia has taken so far, he doesn't really, as far as I can see, have a plausible narrative to present to his population of what they have achieved. I think like a minimum he would need to have control of all of Donbass. Then he could say to his population that we have liberated the suffering people of Donbass from the Nazi regime in Kiev. That would be something he could spin on, and that would be a justification for stopping. But he's not there yet. Especially there are important parts of the Donetsk county that he has not, or oblast, that he has not been able to take. Another problem with stopping now is that it would look very weird or strange that he's not caring more about the territories that he has already declared to be part of Russia, but has no control over. So he's kind of tied himself to the flagpole, what you say, in terms of it's because these territories were declared Russian, it's not easy to stop here. So therefore, it seems he is willing to go on fighting, although what he is achieving at the moment is not very impressive. Now, Volodymyr has gone into details about how the front is working, so I'm not going to do that. I just want to make one point with this slide here, that there are kind of two ways that Russia can achieve its goals in terms of occupying more Ukrainian territory. They can do what they're doing today, kind of slowly moving forward, pushing the Ukrainians back. That is working, but it's working extremely slowly. So even if they're going to continue taking territory at the pace they're doing at the moment, even just taking the rest of the Donetsk county is probably going to take maybe years. So it's a very time-consuming and exhausting way of occupying new territories. The other way would be to have a so-called breakthrough on the front. And breakthrough here has a very particular meaning. It means that the Russian forces at a certain point on the front is able to kind of blow a hole in the Ukrainian defenses that is deep enough and wide enough for other Russian troops to follow or to go through in order to enter rare areas of the Ukrainian armed forces. They may, in principle, be able to kind of create such a hole somewhere on the Ukrainian front. Even that is very difficult, but I wouldn't exclude it. But at the moment, it doesn't seem that the Russia have the reserves that are needed behind the force that actually creates the hole in front. These reserves should then kind of be fresh and move through that hole in the front and enter Ukrainian rare areas and kind of tear up the Ukrainian military from the inside, so to say. And for that, you need also quite a lot of forces, and preferably fresh forces. And those reserves, it doesn't seem that that Russia has. So therefore, I completely agree with Volodymyr in his assessment that the front as it is today is probably going to stay that way, at least for this year and probably for much of next year as well. So that's kind of the military background and the reason why I'm saying that given those preconditions that I mentioned, that I don't think necessarily time is on Russia's side. I would say that it's probably controversial also among Western analysts, but I would say that at least significant or substantial number of Western analysts who look at this war more or less on a daily basis would probably say something of the same. Then I'm going to go a little bit more in detail to the factors in Russia that sustain the Russian war effort, and I'll start with popular opinion. No, sorry, I will just I will go to that, but before I come to that, I will just show you this war report card that Russia Matters, which is an organization in the United States. The last one they produced was from 28th of May, and you basically see in terms of what changes there have been in territory, past month, past week, and so on, and then estimated losses, because we're talking on, also Volodymyr was talking about exhausting Russia. So all these figures are very uncertain, obviously. The figure of 200,000 killed and severely wounded Russians, I would say, it's much lower than the estimates of the Ukrainian General Staff, for instance, but it is kind of a common figure at the moment. The only really independent and kind of methodologically thorough investigation of this is done by Mediazona and BBC in cooperation, and they actually only count Russian soldiers killed on the battlefield where they have the name, and they probably also have the home address of the person. So they know for sure that this person was dead. And according to their estimates, about 55,000 Russian troops are now killed. But then they say that this is the absolute lowest number. So it's been common, I think, for at least for the last year to multiply that number with 3, and then you get to 150,000 killed. And if you add then severely wounded on top of that, severely wounded here means people who cannot return to the fight, then you can easily get to 200,000. I would probably guess it's even more than that. Now, I don't know actually where the figure of 130,000 losses on the Ukrainian side comes from. Zelensky has said something like 31 or something, and that's probably way too low, but anyway, 130,000 may be too much, but I don't know the details behind that number. But at least what you see here is that the exhaustion of Russia that Volodymyr was talking about is actually taking place. Russia is taking significant losses, both in terms of soldiers killed or wounded and in terms of military equipment. And that's actually very important for what I'm going to talk about later also. So to Russian popular opinion on the war, which is, I think, important, because if suddenly the Russian popular opinion turned decisively against the war, that would be a problem even for the Kremlin and even for an authoritarian or even totalitarian regime like Russia. Now, opinion polls in Russia, of course, are completely unreliable, obviously, since you don't know who's asking you when the phone comes. But I think it's still worth having a look at least the stability of this. So what this table shows is that support for the war in terms of it is right to do what we are doing in Ukraine is very stable. Those who consciously oppose the war, they are about somewhere between 10 and 20% of the Russian population. The rest basically thinks that what's been done in Ukraine is a right thing to do. However, when it comes to whether the war should continue or not, the picture changes quite significantly. So, and these figures are also relatively stable. So it seems that there has been more or less since the war started a majority in the Russian population, even when it's dangerous to talk about these things, a majority that thinks that negotiations should be prioritized over continued military activity. So my basic takeaway from these opinion surveys is that the Russian population, a majority of them, think it's justified what their country are doing in Ukraine. but it's not that important for them that they are willing to sacrifice whatever it takes to continue to do this. Now, of course, one problem here is that for many parts of the Russian population, the war has actually led to increased living standards, at least increased salaries, and that is affecting these numbers as well. And that is just because Russia is spending all its money at the moment at this. So it's not like Russia suddenly has become better in economics. It's just that they're spending all their money. So I mean, if we started spending all our savings in our families as well, it would look very, very good for a while, but before things got worse. So that's the population, and in terms of attitudes in the population. Then in terms of Russian military production, these are figures, or that's a table from BOFIT in Finland, which is considered to be one of the best Western analyst environments on this, and you see that war-related industries have had a tremendous increase in production since the major war started. I mean, it's quite staggering actually. But even that is probably not enough, because they are losing, as we talked about before, so much in the war. It seems to be, at least to me at the moment, to be the case that they are not producing as much military equipment as they are losing. That may be different in different types of weaponry, but at least in, for example, in armed vehicles, that seems to be the case. Because that would be the only plausible explanation why they are still, where they are using older and older equipment on the front line. If they were able, for example, in terms of main battle tanks, to produce as many new main battle tanks as they were losing, we wouldn't see armored main battle tanks from the 1950s on the front line. So what that means is that currently Russia is replacing its losses in the war in terms of military equipment, mostly, but it's replacing these losses not with newly produced equipment, but some of that obviously also, but they are able to replenish completely just because they're taking from storages. And these storages cannot last forever. They are big, but they cannot last forever. So sometime next year, or in the beginning of 2026, they're probably going to run out. Then, as Volodymyr talked about, there may be other ways of getting military equipment from North Korea, for example, but I don't think there are that many alternative sources. So this is very important for what Volodymyr talked about in terms of exhaustion. It is actually possible to exhaust Russia in 1-2 years, and then then things will probably be different. Yeah. So how does Russia pay for this war? I thought, well, it pays for this war basically by high income from petroleum sales. Those incomes are still very high, from tax increases, from increases in government debt, and from using from the Russian welfare fund. So one important thing here in terms of the population is at least that even with this extremely high defense expenditures, they haven't so far really taken much out of other budgets. They're still maintaining more or less for education, for healthcare, and so on. That's actually very important obviously for continued popular support. So if you see the table here, the black line is expenditures, and the red line is the result, I mean, in terms of pluses or minus on the budget. So Russia is currently running a minus, a deficit on the state. It uses more than it gets in, but not that much. So it doesn't, in terms of the financing of the war, it doesn't look all that bad, unfortunately. I thought I had one more slide, actually. I think it skipped the slide there. Anyway, I just wanted also to add that Russian defense expenditures rose by, I think, 60% from 2023 to 2024. So it's a huge increase. And actually for the first time ever in the post-Soviet period, in 2024, defense expenditures are higher than social expenditures. So it's amazing amounts of money they're using on this, and probably money is also one of the main reasons why they have been able to not really increase their force on the front line, but they seem to be relatively good at maintaining it at the stable level. Just because going to war now pays quite well for Ukrainian soldiers. I'm speeding through here so that we have ample time for questions, but I do have some conclusions that will, to some extent, summarize what I've already said. So my conclusions in terms of where this is going at the moment is that militarily, Russia is trading minimal territorial gains for major losses in people and equipment. This is the exhaustion that Volodymyr was talking about. It's happening. One may wonder why Putin also doesn't think that this is a bad idea. I mean, the Ukrainians have as their strategy, as we know, heard, to exhaust us, and we are letting ourselves get exhausted. But I think that again comes down to the fact that he cannot really sell the current situation as something like a victory. But if he needs more to show for himself as a victory, so that's why he continues to get exhausted. There is, of course, in this also the question, why hasn't Russia mobilized more already in terms of troops? I mean, there were a lot of rumors before Putin was re-elected and then took up the new presidency that as soon as he was back, as soon as he was elected, he would launch a new round of mobilization. Didn't happen. Either because they think they can do. It may be that the military is telling him that we can do what we need to do with the troops we have. It's possible. We don't know. It's also very likely that an explanation is that there is not enough equipment for the extra troops, and there's no point in mobilizing more people if you don't have the equipment for them. And thirdly, of course, the political and social consequences of a new round of mobilization are potentially very big. I think the estimate now is that about 1 million people have already left Russia since 24th of February 2022 because of the war. And those who leave are the ones you really would like to have, at least in terms of the economy. So all these may be explanations why Russia hasn't mobilized. Secondly, as I said, the Russians in general still think that this war is just, but they are also very fatigued about what's happening, and that's just going to continue. And then the second point here would probably be that the way they are treating their own soldiers, I'm pretty sure that that knowledge of how they're treating their soldiers must reach the Russian society at many levels. People talk to each other also in Russia. So there may be building up an anger at certain aspects of the war in the Russian population that we cannot really see in opinion polls. Third, domestic military production and reluctance to mobilize, as I talked about, are the main Achilles heels for Russia. But also fourthly, based on our estimates and how we read the Russian budgets, and I can say that my colleagues here at the Institute, we read the Russian budgets quite in detail, and also not only the budgets, but how the economy is going. It seems to us that Russia can probably bear the costs of the war at least until 2030. So I would say that in terms of the war going forward, the problem for Russia is more in terms of people than in terms of money. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tor. Very, very interesting, and this presentation as well. And we will now open for questions and comments from the participants here. I'm sure there are questions. You can either use the React or raise hand button, which you find at the bottom via the React. Or you can write the question also in the chat field. So since I don't see any questions yet, I would like, since we are many researchers here and we are part of a research network, I would like to ask you, how easy is it to carry out research on military developments in Ukraine and Russia at the moment? And what kind of sources do you use? I mean, because both parties, I would assume, have an interest in showing results that are positive to themselves, and are you able to use at all primary sources, or do you depend on I mean, in terms of interviews and so on, or are you dependent on secondary sources, and which ones do you trust and which ones don't you trust? And that's to both of you.
Should I go first, or do you want to go first, Volodymyr?
Please, you may go first.
Okay, so I was actually very worried about this when this whole thing started, that we would, because Russia closed down in terms of sources, more or less. And I would say that's still a problem, at least in terms of talking to people. Before 24th of February 2022, we could still talk to people in Moscow. We cannot, basically, anymore. So that is definitely a problem. However, there are other openings for studying this war, and I think the main one is that once the war is on, you can actually see it. And today you can see it much more than you did before, because everybody's taking pictures and videos all the time. So the forest of information is just enormous in that respect. I think there's been some estimate that for every 1 minute of war, there are 40 minutes of commentary. So it's it's just huge, which is a problem in itself, actually. So yes, it's possible to do OSINT. I mean, looking at all these videos, these photographs and so on. I personally don't do that, because you'd have to be kind of full-time engaged to do that. Fortunately, there are people who do, on both sides. So my strategy, at least my strategy at the moment, is not to do the gather the raw data myself from all these videos and whatever you see, but I have chosen a number of those people who do that I trust, and then I base a lot on what they are saying. There are obviously challenges with that, and how can I know that I can trust these people? And all I can say is that some of them I have followed for many years, also before the war, or you just listen to them, compare to what they conclude based on their evidence to what others have done, and so on. I wouldn't say it's far from impossible. In many ways, as I said, there's more information than there used to be, but you need to be even more careful about who you trust. So I also try to, I can give an example. There is one guy on Medusa, a Russian military analyst, who does these kind of things. He tends to be talks about the crisis of the Ukrainian forces all the time. But I listen to him to have that perspective, and then I listen to others who have more kind of optimistic perspective on the Ukrainian chances of success, for instance. So you can balance in that way. Yeah, those are just kind of first thoughts.
Thanks, and I'd also like to bring my own experience. Obviously, that every scholar, every expert have its own methodology of how to follow the ongoing war. But as for me, the main instrument is Telegram channels. I follow several dozens of them, and this is Telegram channels that are followed and filled with information by OSINTers. It also may be some Ukrainian soldiers from the front line, so that is the possibility to receive the first information, and maybe not in terms of numbers, but mainly the perception of the changes, shifts of the war, and what parts of the front line are under suppression of Russians, or maybe other directions are in terms of are not so filled during one period of time. So following such Telegram channels may bring you to the conclusion of the whole situation at the front line. At the same time, it is very important to have some familiars and some your personal links with those who are involved into the service and in different body structures, units. And for example, a friend of mine who is an engineer of drone systems in Ukraine told me some information about shipments of electricity of engines from China and how these developments are going. China increased the percentage of wrecked particles, wrecked engines, and that complicated their proposal for producing drones for some time. But several months ago, the situation changed completely because many supplies occurred and many change of supplies now occur throughout European countries. And also, I had conversations with a guy from the unit in Ukrainian Armed Forces that investigate debris of Russian missiles and drones, and it was in February of 2023, just at the beginning of Russian drones attacks. I mean, attacks by Iranian produced Shaheds, and at that time it was quite a new information about components which are used in production of these drones, and they were from South Korea, from Singapore, from even American companies. So it is very also important to maintain and the land, if we may say so, and to obtain not only this brings you an opportunity to maintain not only public information but receive some kind of undercarpet particles. But anyway, you may not receive all the information from just from one source or rely to this source. You have to pick up many particles of this picture, and only after that you may create your understanding of the current developments and the ground to forecast the future developments.
Thank you for these answers. We have one hand. I urge you to ask questions to others as well. We have Alexandra Deineko.
Yes, dear Volodymyr, dear Tor, thank you very much for extremely interesting presentations. And I actually have questions to both of you. My first question is to Volodymyr. When you presented this first part, when it comes to the discourses that were circulating in Ukrainian society regarding the vision of Ukraine's victory in the war and other things, I was wondering about the data that you used to develop these conclusions, because at least in my point of view, now we have at least three main actors who actually elaborates quite different discourses. We have official authorities and official discourse. We have ordinary Ukrainian citizens, and we have military and military discourse. And for example, considering new Mobilization Act, we may conclude that there are quite different opinions and estimation when it comes to ordinary civilian Ukrainians and, for example, Ukrainian soldiers. So I was wondering what kind of data you used to develop these conclusions, and have you noticed some sort of contradictions between these different actors who produce quite different messages, at least in my opinion? And my question to Tor, Actually, this winter there was a lot of messages from the Russian side in the media considering Putin's plan to continue war until 2026. And some of the Ukrainian researchers concluded that actually it was a sign that the Russian economy is going to collapse after that. So my question to you, can you share with us, maybe there is something in your data considering this timeline, or how can you comment these messages from their side? Thank you so much.
Shall we start with Volodymyr?
Thank you, Alexandra, for a very precise question. As I mentioned before starting the presentation, these notes are based mainly on the perception of my own experience of following the Ukrainian media and communication, and all we may undermine and put under the umbrella of the informational space of Ukraine under the war. And that is not based on a precise sociological studies. Of course, Ukrainian sociological companies provide pools among Ukrainian citizens, but the main question is about the belief of the possibility of the Ukrainian victory. But that does not give us any conclusions about what is the vision of this victory. And obviously, under different circumstances of the war and complicated developments, this perception is changed. And you are very correct about the different dimensions of the perception of the war and different ways to communicate on that, because the Ukrainian authorities has their own goals, and they rely on still, even we do not conduct any elections and political process is freezed, but anyway, they are still counting ratings and make political decisions, and they have to take into account their ratings when they come to some decisions that are even tied with the key directions, key decisions regarding the war. So yes, of course, we may not receive and we may not conclude that these notes that I brought is and they portray and reflect the whole and all traits, all levels of Ukrainian society, but I tried to bring the main narratives that and the main vision that may conclude Ukrainians as the society, because the military and civilians are at the same boat, and obviously there is a challenge of the traumatic experience by Ukrainian military, and obviously that will pose many challenges after the war, and even now it occurs when soldiers came to the rear and they witness this distinction between the peaceful life in the rear and what is going on at the front line. And that will be the challenge for decades for Ukraine. But anyway, in our communication with foreigners, with external audiences, we should focus on the main line of Ukrainian narrative and how and keep the single vision of how Ukraine received our goal in this war, because if it will be partialized and received in different ways, Russia will intervene into the informational dimension, disrupt us, and that will bring us to the brink of the defeat.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Alexandra. So actually, in our team at FFI, I'm not the one doing the analysis of the economy. I really wished I had my colleague Cecilia here, because she would be able to answer you much more fully. And she is a trained economist. And I'm basically, what I presented in terms of the Russian economy is based on her, and as well as her colleague Julia's conclusions. So what I can say, I guess, is that one of their main points is that Russia is borrowing from its own population at the moment, and you can do that for some time. It's actually a little bit like I don't know if you look at the Norwegian TV serial Luksusfellen, but it's something of the same, that you can borrow for quite some time and have and look tremendously successful. The problem comes when you have to start paying back on your loans, and that will basically strike Russia first around 2030, as far as I understand from my colleagues. So that would be the main answer. There are additional answers, in the sense that the sanctions are, it's not that they're not working, but they're not working extremely well. So we would probably say that if the sanctions had not been there, Russia would have done even much better than it's doing now, and even had more money to continue the war. So they are working in that sense, but they're not working in terms of pushing Russia closer to some kind of collapse. And even I know the Russian economist Alexashenko says that it's not even quite clear what the word economic collapse means. It's probably more a question of gradual degradation than of a collapse. One caveat again here would probably be that a lot also of our analysis and estimates are based on the Rostat data, and there are increasingly questions about the reliability of those data. We do have other data as well, so we compare and try to find the best estimate. But there are uncertainties in terms of the data. Yeah, you should keep that in mind as well. I think that's the best I can do in terms of answering. It's a very good question.
Thank you so much.
Thank you to all three. Next question or comment is from Marte Hando Myhre.
Thank you both for great presentations. I have a couple of questions. The one relates to what Volodymyr mentioned about infrastructure, about Russia's damage of Ukrainian infrastructure as something that could sort of tip the direction of the war. And could we see a large, so to speak, exodus from Ukraine this winter as a consequence of this, or are repairment ongoing, and so that one can tackle these destructions? And my second question is related to recently occupied territories. So what do we know about the situation in this more recently occupied territories? You were showing us Avdiivka and how Russia is making advancements in further that direction, and how quickly do Russia manage to sort of fasten their grip in these territories? It's a question to both of you.
Yes, if I may, I'd like to start with just a brief overlook of the Russian strategy to hit Ukrainian electricity, mainly electricity infrastructure, and that is the continuation of the initial phase of Russian attempts to make a pressure on Ukrainian society after the initial phase of this strategy was imposed by Russians in October 2022. I may remind you that this strategy is and the author of this strategy is rumored with Solovian, the former commander of Russian aerial forces. So the main Russian idea is to exhaust Ukrainian society because these attacks and deficit of electricity in Ukrainian grid is not combined with the military power of Ukrainian forces, and it has almost no effect on our capabilities in military terms. And if we have a look at the military production, they are quite safe because of the it was quite predictable that Russia will try to exhaust Ukraine in energy sphere. So the main target and the targeted population is simple Ukrainians. So the main impact is put on Ukrainian economy because it slows down many chains, many interconnections in Ukrainian small businesses. But anyway, we have experience of winter of 2022-2023, so that is not so harassed for us. For simple Ukrainians, we are prepared, and if we follow official commentaries by Energoatom and other representatives of energy organizations, state organizations, several nuclear power plants are under preparation for the winter. So our main pillar is obviously nuclear power plants, and we maintain control over 15 reactors, so it will provide Ukraine enough electricity to maintain. Obviously, the deficit will remain, but still, Ukraine will obtain enough gigawatts in its electricity grid to maintain at the level when Ukrainian population will receive about 8 or 10 hours with electricity per day, and it is enough to maintain the economy work as it is experienced by previous periods of Russian attacks. And what about occupied territories? Of course, there are many sources of how we follow this situation there. For example, quite actively are used Telegram bots, and people who resist Russians who support Ukraine, but they have left at the occupied territories. They provide very useful information to Ukrainian intelligence through these bots in Telegram and other social networks. And also we gather information from personal connections because many relatives left there. But obviously there is a risk of Russians spreading disinformation through these sources. So the decisions which are made on this type of information should be served and should be made only after we receive information from another sources, from independent OSINT information, and if we turn to the military attacks, to the exhaustion of Russian anti-defense systems in Crimea, we mainly dependent on the intelligence sources which are provided and reconnaissance sources which are provided by our Western partners.
Now, if I can just add to what you, Volodymyr, said on the last question, I think there's well, the details and the statistics of this we will only know later, obviously, but Russia will have the same difficulties as any occupying power will have. It's very difficult to become popular if you're an occupying power. And that may be the case even if you actually try to get the population on your side. And this is just because when you occupy territory, you would probably like to stay friends with those who are willing to receive you as such. But you want also root out those who are against you, but you don't know who they are. So as an occupying power, you will always overreact in a sense, and that will just create you even more enemies. And then on top of this, Russia has, I mean, in Western military thinking, population-centric fight has been a concept for some time, in the sense that the winner will be the actor who has the population on his side. That's never been strong in Russian military thinking. Actually, there was some development in this direction within the KGB during the war in Afghanistan, but that's more or less the only example I've seen or know about where they have tried to really get the population in occupied territories on their side. So this is difficult for everybody. Actually, if you want to read a good novel on how this works in practice, you could read "The Moon is Down" by John Steinbeck, written about actually where Norway was the example written during the Second World War. It explains in novel form how difficult it is to be popular as an occupying power. But then on top of this, you have the Russian very negative traditions as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Volodymyr and Tor. I think this is all we have time for actually today. So thanks for very enlightening presentations, very good discussions, questions, and thanks to all who showed up. We will continue to run this series of seminars. The next one will be in the fall. You will receive information if you follow our webpage and or Facebook group and newsletter. So I would just end by wishing you all a very good vacation, and we will of course continue to follow the dreadful war in Ukraine. We really hope for better days to come. I think that the prospects are there, although there are many caveats, as you have both mentioned. So let's continue. I think this will be a topic also for further seminars in the network. But with that, I will say thank you, everyone, and hoping to see you next time in the fall. Bye-bye.
Recording stopped.